My stepmother burned my mother's letters in the fireplace while I watched. She did it slowly, one by one. She read the envelopes aloud first, savoring the postmarks, the addresses, the proof that someone had loved me enough to write. To my Juliet she read, holding the first letter over the flames, from a leaner, how sentimental. Then she dropped it. The paper curled, blackened, turned to ash in seconds. I was on my knees. I had found the box that morning, hidden in the attic behind a false wall, 643 letters my mother had written me over 15 years. Letters I was told had been destroyed. Letters I was told didn't exist. I had carried them downstairs in my arms like a child, weeping, planning to read every word, to finally know the woman my father had erased. Victoria took them from me. She was stronger than she looked. A former model, 20 years younger than my father, with the kind of beauty that made people underestimate her cruelty. She wrenched the box from my hands, spilled the letters across the Persian rug, and dragged me to the fireplace by my hair. "Your father left me everything," she said, as the first letter caught fire. "The house, the estate, the literary rights. And you are the daughter of a madwoman who abandoned you. Who would believe you?" I lunged for the hearth. I grabbed a handful of envelopes. The flames licked my fingers, my palms, my wrists. I didn't feel the pain. I felt the loss. I felt 15 years of love turning to smoke. Victoria kicked me backward. I hit the marble coffee table with my shoulder, my head cracking against the edge. She stood over me, the firelight making her face demonic, and she smiled. "Security," she called, her voice sweet as poison. "Miss Juliet is having another episode. She's delusional again. She thinks her dead mother is writing to her. Please remove her." Gently. "She's fragile." They dragged me out. Past the portrait of my father that hung in the foyer, the great editor, the literary lion, the man who'd told me my mother was unstable, that she'd chosen not to be a mother, that the letters she'd sent begging to see me were destructive fantasies. Past the shelves of books he'd published, including the poetry that had made his fortune, poetry he'd stolen from her, I now knew. Poetry that had won him prizes, respect, a knighthood he'd died wearing. I was thrown onto the gravel driveway. The gates locked behind me. I lay there, my hands blistered and smoking, my hair full of ash, and I screamed into the dark. Not from pain. From the particular grief of watching your only evidence of love turn to smoke. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're here, maybe you know what it means to have someone destroy the only proof that you were ever loved. Maybe you know the rage of watching a thief wear your grief like a brooch. Maybe you know what it's like to be called crazy for mourning something that was real. If that's you, subscribe. Not because I have comfort, because I have a match. And because the story I'm about to tell you ends with me standing in a ballroom full of cultural elites, my burned hands holding my mother's final poem, while my stepmother watched her legacy turn to ash on every screen in the room. Here's my story. I was 7 when my mother disappeared. I remember the morning before. She was in the garden, wearing a dress the color of lavender, writing in a notebook with a pencil she held like a paintbrush. She looked up when I came out, and her face changed not to annoyance but to light. The way a room changes when you turn on a lamp. "Juliet," she said, "come here, I want to show you something." She read me a poem. Not a children's poem, a real one, about a woman who turned into a bird and flew away from a cage made of music. I didn't understand all the words, but I understood the feeling. The longing, the wings. "Will you fly away?" I asked her. She looked at me for a long time. Then she touched my cheek, her fingers smelling of graphite and dirt. "Not from you," she said, "never from you." That night my father came home late. I heard them arguing, not shouting. My parents didn't shout. They spoke in low, precise sentences like surgeons cutting. I heard my mother's voice rise once, a single word, "no." Then silence. In the morning she was gone. My father sat me at the kitchen table and told me in the same voice he used for book reviews that my mother had chosen to leave, that she was unwell, that she had decided motherhood wasn't for her. He showed me a letter typed, not handwritten, where she supposedly renounced all parental rights. "She doesn't want to see you, Juliet. It's better this way. We must respect her choice." I didn't believe him, not at first. I waited for her. I wrote letters in crayon and left them in the mailbox. I looked for her at the garden gate, at the school gates, in every crowd. I dreamed of her every night for a year. Then the dreams stopped and I started to believe. My father remarried when I was 12. Victoria was 28, blonde, with a smile that never reached her eyes. She moved into my mother's house, slept in my mother's bed, wore my mother's jewelry. She was kind to me in public and indifferent in private. She called me the little reader and the dramatic one, and just like your mother, the last said with a twist of her mouth that made it an insult. I left for university at 18 and didn't come back for 10 years. I studied manuscript restoration, the art of bringing dead words back to life. I worked in archives, in monasteries, in museums where the air smelled of mold and time. I learned to read damage, to see what was hidden beneath stains and burns and watermarks. I became good at finding what others had lost. I only returned because my father died. A heart attack sudden while reading proofs at his desk. Victoria called me. She sounded appropriately grief-stricken. He wanted you here, she lied. For the reading of the will. I didn't care about the will. I cared about the letters. My father had mentioned them once, drunk, at a Christmas dinner when I was 16. Your mother wrote you letters, he'd slurred. Hundreds of them, begging to see you. Pathetic, really. I burned them. I'd run to my room and cried until I vomited, but some part of me, the part that restored manuscripts, that believed in layers, never fully believed him. My father was a liar. He lied for a living. He turned fiction into truth and truth into ash. I came back to find what he'd hidden. The house was unchanged. The same dark wood, the same heavy curtains, the same smell of leather and old paper. Victoria greeted me at the door in black silk, her eyes red with what might have been crying or might have been eye drops. Juliet, you look exhausted. The funeral was hard on all of us. I'm not here for the funeral, I said. I'm here for my mother's things, she laughed. A musical sound practiced. Your mother's things? Darling, your mother had nothing. She left with a suitcase and a dream. Everything in this house belongs to your father, to me. She had papers, manuscripts, letters destroyed. Victoria's smile didn't waver. Your father told you he burned them for your own good. She was a disturbed woman, Juliet, obsessive, delusional. You don't want to read the ramblings of a madwoman. I want to decide that for myself. She stepped closer. She smelled of gardenias and something metallic. The will is tomorrow. Be a good daughter. Mourn your father. Accept what he left you. And let the dead stay buried. I didn't sleep that night. I searched the house. The study where my father's desk was locked and Victoria had the only key. The library where his books, including the poetry that had made him famous, lined the walls like trophies. The bedroom where Victoria slept in my mother's bed and I could smell her perfume on the pillows. I found nothing. Until dawn when I climbed to the attic. The attic was where I'd hidden as a child. A small space behind the water tank, accessible through a closet in the guest room. I'd found it by accident, chasing a cat, and had used it as a fortress, a place to read, to cry, to be invisible. The false wall was still there. I pushed it aside with trembling hands. Behind it was a metal box. Rusted locked, the key taped to the bottom with yellowed adhesive. I opened it, and I found my mother, not her body, her voice. 643 letters, bound in twine, organized by date. The first was dated 3 weeks after her disappearance. The last was dated 2 days before her death, 15 years later. I sat on the attic floor and read the first one. My hands shook so hard I could barely hold the paper. My dearest Juliet, it began. I am writing this from a room with bars on the windows. Your father says I am unwell. He says I am dangerous to you. He says if I love you, I must stay away, but I do not believe him. I believe in you. I believe in the girl who listened to poems in the garden. I believe you will find these letters someday. I believe you will know I never left. I read until my eyes burned. I read about the institution, Silverwood Private Care, a rest facility for women with nervous conditions. I read about the treatments, cold baths, isolation, medication that made her tongue thick and her hands shake. I read about the doctors who were paid by my father, who reported what he wanted to hear, who signed papers saying she was unfit and delusional and a danger to herself and others. And I read about the poetry. My mother, Elinor Vane, had been a poet before she was a wife. She'd published one collection, small, acclaimed, quickly forgotten, when she was 23. My father had been her editor. He'd married her for her talent, then spent their marriage convincing her it belonged to him. The letters described it, how he'd taken her notebooks, how he'd submitted her poems under his own name with minor changes to major journals, how he'd built his reputation first as an editor then as a writer on her words, how when she threatened to expose him he had her committed. He tells everyone I am mad, she wrote in year 3, and I am beginning to believe him. The walls here are soft. The food has no taste. I write poems in my head because they took my pencils. I recite them to the radiator, to the window, to the spider in the corner. I am a poet without paper, a mother without a child, a woman without a name, but she kept writing. In year 5, a nurse named Miriam smuggled her a pencil. In year 7, paper. In year 10, a notebook. My mother wrote an epic, The Daughter of Ashes, a poem cycle about a mother imprisoned by her husband, who writes letters that never arrive, who burns her own hair to make ink, who dies believing her child hates her but never stops loving. She sent the letters, every week, for 15 years. She gave them to nurses, to orderlies, to visitors she bribed with poems. And someone, my father, Victoria, a system of silence, intercepted them all, until the last one, dated 2 days before her death. She was 4 to 5, she'd been in Silverwood for 18 years. My Juliet, it read, I am dying. The doctors say pneumonia, but I know it is grief. I have held you in every letter, I have raised you in every line, I have loved you more than any wall could hold. Find the poems. Find Miriam. Let them know I was here. Let them know I never flew away from you, I was only caged. I held the letter to my chest. I sat in the dust and the dark and I wept for the first time since I was 7, not for my father's death, for my mother's life. For the 18 years she'd spent writing to a daughter who never wrote back, believing I hated her, believing she'd been forgotten. I didn't hear Victoria come up the stairs. I didn't hear her until she spoke. Well, she said, you found the trash. I looked up. She was standing in the attic doorway, backlit by the morning sun, her silhouette sharp as a blade. She held a fire poker in one hand. Give them to me, she said. No, Juliet. She sighed, the sigh of a woman dealing with a tiresome child. Your father left me everything. The house. The estate. Literary rights to all his work. And these, she gestured at the letters, these are evidence of theft, of fraud, of crimes that would destroy his legacy. And mine. Do you think I will let a bitter daughter ruin what I built? You built nothing. You married a thief. I married a genius. She stepped closer, and I will protect what is mine. She took the letters. I tried to stop her, but she was stronger, and I was weak from grief and discovery. She dragged the box downstairs. I followed, screaming, grabbing at her, pulling her hair. She threw me against the banister and marched into the drawing room. The fire was already lit. She must have prepared it. What happened next I described at the beginning. The burning, the smoke, my hands in the flames, the security guards dragging me out. I was left on the gravel with blistered palms and a head full of ash. Victoria stood in the doorway, the firelight behind her, and waved. Goodbye, Juliet. Don't come back. The will is tomorrow. And you are unwell. I've already called Dr. Harrow. He'll take good care of you, Dr. Harrow, the same psychiatrist who'd signed my mother's commitment papers, the same man who diagnosed her with hysterical delusion and maternal rejection syndrome. He was still practicing, still on my father's payroll, still ready to certify that any woman who questioned the narrative was insane. I ran. I didn't know where. I ran until my lungs burned worse than my hands, until I was in the village, until I collapsed against the wall of a church and a woman with kind eyes found me. Her name was Miriam. She was 6 to 3. She'd been a nurse at Silverwood for 20 years. She'd smuggled my mother pencils, paper, hope, and she'd kept the originals. I couldn't save her, Miriam said as we sat in her cottage, drinking tea from chipped cups, but I could save her words. She made me promise. Give them to my daughter when she's free. I didn't know if you'd ever be free. I didn't know if you even knew she existed. She brought out a wooden chest. Inside were notebooks, hundreds of pages. My mother's handwriting, the same looping script from the letters, but wilder, more desperate, more alive. The original manuscripts of every poem my father had published, dated years before his submissions. With her name, her notes, her tears staining the margins, and The Daughter of Ashes, complete. 4,000 lines, written in pencil, then ink, then in the final cantos in a substance that looked brown and smelled of copper. Miriam confirmed it. In the last years when they took even her pencils, Eleanor had pulled out her own hair, burned it to ash, mixed it with her own blood, and written with a sharpened stick. She called it the truest ink, Miriam said. She said, if they take everything, I will make myself the pen. I held the manuscript. I felt the weight of it, not just paper. Sacrifice. Love, a life compressed into words. What do? I asked. Miriam looked at me. She looked at my bandaged hands. You finish what she started, she said. You become the daughter of ashes. You burn what needs burning. I didn't go to the will reading. I didn't need to. Victoria inherited everything, the house, the estate, the literary rights, the reputation. She announced a memorial edition of my father's complete works. She sold the film rights to a streaming service for a biographical series. She became the literary widow, the preserver of genius, the woman who'd stood by a difficult man. I became no one, a ghost with burned hands. I lived in Miriam's spare room. I worked at a pub washing dishes, my hands wrapped in gauze. I read my mother's manuscript until I knew it by heart, until I could recite it in my sleep, until I was it, and I planned. The series was called The Editor's Muse. It was Victoria's vanity project, funded by the streaming service, produced by her own company. It told the story of my father, the great editor who discovered Eleanor Vane, married her, tried to save her from her demons, and mourned her tragic end. Victoria played herself in later episodes. An actress played my mother as a beautiful, unstable waif who'd chosen her art over her family. I applied for a job as a historical authenticity consultant. I used a fake name, a fake resume, references from Miriam's contacts in the literary world. I wore gloves to the interview to hide my scars. I spoke about my father's work with the reverence Victoria expected. I was hired. For 6 months, I worked in the production offices. I verified dates. I corrected costumes. I smiled when Victoria entered the room and called me darling. I was invisible. I was furniture. I was exactly what she thought she'd destroyed. But I was also watching, learning, the editing suite, the server room, the master controls for the premiere gala, which would be held in the mansion, my mother's house, now Victoria's, with 400 guests, live streaming and global press. I made copies of everything, the contracts, the financials, the emails where Victoria discussed creative liberties with the director, the messages where she admitted my father's early work was heavily influenced by Eleanor's unpublished material, legal speak for stolen, and I prepared the manuscript, not to publish, not yet, to perform. I memorized The Daughter of Ashes in its entirety, 4,000 lines. I practiced in Miriam's cottage, in the woods, in the shower. I learned to modulate my voice, the way my mother had described reading to me in the garden, the way she'd recited to spiders and radiators, the way she'd whispered through walls. I became a leaner, more than Victoria could ever imagine. The night of the premiere, I arrived early. I was wearing a dress the color of lavender, my mother's color from the last morning. My hands were bare, the scars visible, pale and shiny against my skin. I wore no makeup. My hair was loose, the way my mother's had been in the photograph Miriam gave me. Victoria was radiant. White silk, diamonds. The widow who'd become a star. She greeted guests at the door of the mansion, kissing cheeks, accepting condolences that had become congratulations. The cultural elite of the city was there. Publishers who'd profited from my father's theft. Critics who'd praised his original voice. Actors who'd built careers on the lie. I stood in the back, near the AV controls. The technician knew me. I'd brought him coffee for 3 months, asked about his dog, learned his schedule. He trusted me to watch the board while he took a bathroom break. At 8:00 p.m., Victoria took the stage in the ballroom. The screens behind her showed the series poster, my father's face, stern and literary, with a woman's shadow behind him. Tonight, Victoria said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion, we celebrate the preservation of a great legacy. My husband was not just a writer. He was a voice for women who could not speak. He gave Eleanor Vane immortality, and I am honored to continue his work. She pressed the button to start the first episode. I pressed mine first. The screens went black, the room murmured, then my mother's face, not the actress, the real Eleanor. A photograph Miriam had saved, young, smiling, holding a notebook. Then another and another. Eleanor in the garden. Eleanor at a reading. Eleanor in a hospital gown, thin but fierce, writing on a wall with her own blood. Then the documents, the commitment papers, signed by my father, the medical records, the payments to Silverwood from my father's accounts. The publication dates of his poems side by side with my mother's manuscripts dated years earlier. Then the video, the one I'd recorded on my phone hidden in my pocket the morning Victoria burned the letters. Her voice, clear and cruel, your father left me everything. The house, the estate, the literary rights, and you are the daughter of a madwoman. The room was silent, then gasps, then shouting. I walked onto the stage. I didn't run, I didn't sneak. I walked in my lavender dress with my burned hands under the lights that had once celebrated my father's theft. Victoria turned, she saw me. Her face went white, then red, then a color I'd never seen on human skin. You, she whispered. Me, I said. I took the microphone. My name is Juliet Vane. I am Eleanor Vane's daughter, and I am here to introduce you to the woman you tried to erase. I held up the manuscript, the original, the one written in blood and ash. This is The Daughter of Ashes, I said, my mother's final poem, written in a psychiatric institution where my father imprisoned her. Written with her own hair, her own blood, because they took everything else. It is 4,000 lines long. I have memorized every one. I began to recite. The poem was about a mother, a cage, letters that never arrived. A child who grew up not knowing she was loved. It was about walls that softened until they became wombs, about time that moved differently for the imprisoned, about love that outlasted every attempt to kill it. I recited for 40 minutes. The room was silent. No one moved. No one checked their phone. Victoria stood frozen, her white dress gleaming, her face cracking like porcelain. When I reached the final canto, the one my mother wrote 2 days before her death, my voice broke. Not from weakness, from the weight of the words. And if my daughter finds this ash, I recited, let her know I burned myself to light her way. Let her know the fire was not my end. It was my alphabet. Let her read me in the smoke. Let her breathe me in. Let her become the daughter I could not raise, and let her raise the dead with her own hands. I stopped. The silence was absolute. Then I looked at Victoria. You burned her letters, I said. You burned 15 years of love. You thought ash was the end, but my mother knew better. She knew that ash is where the phoenix begins. I turned to the audience. Eleanor Vane was not mad. She was not a muse. She was a poet, a mother, a prisoner of a man who stole her words and called them his own. And this woman, I pointed at Victoria, this woman who calls herself a preserver of legacy, burned the only proof that Eleanor loved her daughter. Because love is dangerous to thieves. It reminds the world that the stolen thing had an owner. A man stood up in the front row. A lawyer I recognized from the publishing world. Miss Vane, he said, I represent the Eleanor Vane literary estate. We would like to discuss the immediate termination of all contracts with Victoria Hale, pending investigation of fraud, copyright infringement, and criminal destruction of evidence. Another man stood, a critic. I wrote my dissertation on Hale's early work. If this is true, it is true, said a voice from the back, Miriam. She was standing, 6 to 3 years old, in her nurse's uniform, holding a box of medical records. I was there. I treated Eleanor Vane. I witnessed the abuse. And I have the original manuscripts, dated and authenticated, that prove every word Juliet has spoken. The room erupted, not with applause, with the sound of a lie collapsing under its own weight. Victoria tried to speak. She tried to say this is slander, this is a setup, she's unstable, just like her mother. But the screens were still showing the documents. The dates, the proof, and her own voice, burning letters saying who would believe you. Security came, not for me, for her. The streaming service's legal team had already called the police. The mansion was sealed. The contracts were void. And Victoria, the woman who'd worn my mother's bed, my mother's jewelry, my mother's stolen reputation, was escorted out through the kitchen, her white dress trailing in the grease, while photographers who'd come for glamour shots took pictures of her ruin. I didn't watch her leave. I was holding my mother's manuscript. I was feeling the weight of 4,000 lines. I was finally, after 31 years, holding my mother in my hands. The investigation took 2 years. My father's knighthood was posthumously revoked, the first time in history for a literary figure. His books were pulled from print. The prizes he'd won were returned, rewarded to my mother's estate. Victoria was charged with fraud, destruction of evidence, and accessory to false imprisonment. She pled guilty to avoid trial, served 18 months, and emerged to find that the world had forgotten her. She lives now in a studio apartment, selling vintage clothes online, her name synonymous with literary theft. I published The Daughter of Ashes with an independent press. It became the best-selling poetry collection of the decade. It won prizes my father had stolen, in ceremonies where I accepted on my mother's behalf. I didn't keep the money. I established Eleanor's Letters, a foundation that recovers manuscripts by women writers institutionalized by their families in the 20th century. We have found 43 so far: poets, novelists, diarists, women who wrote in blood, in ash, in anything they could find, women who were called mad because they refused to be silent. The mansion became our archive. I bought it from the liquidated estate with Miriam's help, with donors who believed in the work and converted every room. The drawing room where Victoria burned the letters is now the reading room. The fireplace is sealed. Above it hangs my mother's photograph, the one from the garden, and below it, a glass case. Inside is a jar of ash, the only remains of 643 letters. I had them collected from the chimney, sifted, preserved. The label reads, Eleanor to Juliet, 19,952,010. Love does not burn. I live in the attic, the same attic where I found the box. I've made it a studio, light, air, space to work. I restore manuscripts there. I read my mother's words there. And every morning, I open the window and look at the garden where she last held me, where she last smiled, where she promised she'd never fly away. She didn't fly away, she was pushed, but I have learned to fly for both of us. I'm Juliet. I'm 31 years old. I'm a daughter, a restorer, a woman who was told her mother was mad and learned that madness was just another word for would not be silenced. I am the daughter of ashes, and I am still writing her story. If someone ever burned the proof that you were loved, or if they called you crazy for mourning something they told you wasn't real, drop a below. I read every single comment. And if this story made you want to sift through the ash for what they tried to hide, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. What are you finally ready to raise from the ashes?